The story of Nicholas Nickleby concerns a family, some members of which share their Christian names. They're named after each other, and it can be a little bit confusing. One of the major characters is Mr. Ralph Nickleby. Actually, he's the villain. And we hear about him in the first chapter when he was a schoolboy. Money was the most important thing to Ralph Nickleby. And he used to lend money at interest to his school friends. He wasn't concerned with complicated calculations. The basis of his money lending was twopence for every halfpenny. So in other words, if you borrowed a halfpenny, you had to pay twopence back. We hear a great deal more about Mr. Ralph Nickleby in the second chapter. But you need to know what his arrangement for interest, lending money to his school friends, means. Twopence a halfpenny. Every halfpenny you borrow, you have to pay twopence back. And there were, of course, 2 halfpennies in every penny. A halfpenny is a half penny. Chapter 1. There once lived in a sequestered part of the county of Devonshire one Mr. Godfrey Nickleby, a worthy gentleman who, taking it into his head rather late in life that he must get married, and not being young enough or rich enough to aspire to the hand of a lady of fortune, had wedded an old flame out of mere attachment, who in her turn had taken him for the same reason. Thus, 2 people who cannot afford to play cards for money sometimes sit down to a quiet game for love. Some ill-conditioned persons who sneer at the life matrimonial may perhaps suggest in this place that the good couple would be better likened to 2 principals in a sparring match, who, when fortune is low and backers scarce, will chivalrously set to for the mere pleasure of the buffeting. And in one respect, indeed, this comparison would hold good. For just as the adventurous pair of the Fives Court will afterwards send round the hat and trust to the bounty of the lookers-on for means of regaling themselves, so Mr. Godfrey Nickleby and his partner, the honeymoon being over, looked wistfully out into the world, relying in no inconsiderable degree upon chance for the improvement of their means. Mr. Nickleby's income at that period of his marriage fluctuated between 60 and 80 pounds per annum. 60 and 80 pounds a year. There are people enough in the world, heaven knows, and even in London, where Mr. Nickleby dwelt in those days, but few complaints prevail of the population being scanty. It is extraordinary how long a man may look among the crowd without discovering the face of a friend, but it is no less true. Mr. Nickleby looked and looked till his eyes became sore as his heart, but no friend appeared. And when, growing tired of the search, he turned his eyes homeward, he saw very little there to relieve his weary vision. A painter who has gazed too long upon some glaring colour refreshes his dazzled sight by looking upon a darker and more sombre tint. But everything that met Mr. Nickleby's gaze wore so black and gloomy a hue that he would have been past description refreshed by the very reverse of the contrast. At length, after 5 years, when Mrs. Nickleby had presented her husband with a couple of sons, and that embarrassed gentleman, impressed with the necessity of making some provision for his family, was seriously revolving in his mind a little commercial speculation of insuring his life next quarter-day, and then falling from the top of the monument by accident, there came one morning by the General Post a black-bordered letter to inform him of how his uncle, Mr. Ralph Nickleby, not the Ralph Nickleby I told you about, how Mr. Godfrey Nickleby's uncle, Mr. Ralph Nickleby, was dead, and informed him that he had left the bulk of his little property, amounting in all to £5,000 sterling, to him. As the deceased had taken no further notice of his nephew in his lifetime than sending his eldest boy, who had been christened after him on desperate speculation, a silver spoon in a morocco case, which, as he had not too much to eat with it, seemed a kind of satire upon his having been born without that useful article of plate in his mouth, Mr. Godfrey Nickleby could at first scarcely believe the tidings thus conveyed to him. On examination, however, they seemed to be strictly true. The amiable old gentleman had intended to leave the whole of his fortune, £5,000, to the Royal Humane Society, and had indeed executed a will to that effect. But the institution, having been unfortunate enough a few months before to save the life of a poor relation to whom he paid a weekly allowance of 3 shillings and 6pence, he had, in a fit of very natural exasperation, revoked the request in a codicil, and left it all to Mr. Godfrey Nickleby, with a special mention of his indignation not only against the Royal Humane Society for saving the poor relation's life, but against the poor relation also for allowing himself to be saved. With a portion of this property, Mr. Godfrey Nickleby purchased a small farm near Dawlish in Devonshire, whither he retired with his wife and 2 children to live upon the rest and the interest he could get from his money and the little produce he could raise from his land. The two prospered so well together that when he died some 15 years later, and some 5 years after his wife, he was enabled to leave to his eldest son, Ralph, he was the naughty schoolboy, £3,000 in cash, and to his younger son, Nicholas, £1,000 and the farm, which was as small a landed estate as one would desire to possess. These 2 brothers had been brought up together in a school at Exeter, and being accustomed to go home once a week, had often heard from their mother's lips long accounts of their father's sufferings in his days of poverty and of their deceased uncle's importance in his days of affluence. which recitals produced a very different impression on the two. For while the younger, Nicholas, who was of a timid and retiring disposition, gleaned from thence nothing but forewarnings to shun the great world and attach himself to the quiet routine of a country life, Ralph, the elder, deduced from the often repeated tale the two great morals, that riches are the only true source of happiness and power, and that it is lawful and just to compass their acquisition, in other words, to get them, by all means, short of felony. And, reasoned Ralph with himself, if no good came of my uncle's money when he was alive, a great deal of good came of it after he was dead, inasmuch as my father has got it now and is saving it up for me, which is a highly virtuous purpose, and going back to the old gentleman, good did come of it too, for he had the pleasure of thinking about it all his life long, and of being envied and courted by his family besides. And Ralph always wound up these mental soliloquies by arriving at the conclusion that there was nothing like money. Not confining himself to theory or permitting his faculties to rust, even at that early age, in mere abstract speculations, this promising lad commenced lending money on a limited scale at school, putting out at good interest a small capital of slate, pencil, and marbles, and gradually extending his operations until they aspired to the copper coinage of the realm, in which he speculated to considerable advantage. Nor did he trouble his borrowers with abstract calculations of figures or references to ready reckoners, his simple rule of interest being all comprised in one golden sentence: twopence for every halfpenny. Every halfpenny you borrow, you pay back twopence. This greatly simplified the accounts, and which, as a familiar precept, more easily acquired and retained in the memory than any known rule of arithmetic. And it cannot be too strongly recommended to the notice of capitalists, both large and small, and more especially of money brokers and bill discounters. Indeed, to do these gentlemen justice, many of them are to this day in the frequent habit of adopting it, with evident success. In like manner did young Ralph Nickleby avoid all those minute and intricate calculations of odd days which nobody who has worked sums in simple interest can fail to have found most embarrassing, by establishing the one general rule that all sums of principal and interest, that is the money you borrow and the interest added, should be paid on pocket money day, that is to say on Saturday, and that whether a loan was contracted on the Monday or the Friday, the amount of interest should be in both cases the same. Indeed, he argued, and with great show of reason, that it ought to be rather more for one day than for 5, inasmuch as the borrower might in the former case be fairly presumed to be in great extremity, otherwise he would not borrow at all with such odds against him. This fact is interesting as illustrating the secret connection and sympathy which always exists between great minds. Though Master Ralph Nickleby was not at the time aware of it, the class of gentlemen before alluded to money-lenders and capitalists proceed on just the same principle in all their transactions. From what we have said of this young gentleman and the natural admiration the reader will immediately conceive of his character, it may perhaps be inferred that he is to be the hero of the work, which we shall presently begin. To set this point at rest at once and forever, we hasten to undeceive him and stride to its commencement. He is certainly not the hero. On the death of his father, Ralph Nickleby, who had some time been placed in a mercantile house in London, applied himself passionately to his old pursuit of money-getting, in which he speedily became so buried and absorbed that he quite forgot his brother for many years, and if at times quite remembered his old playfellow, the memory broke through to him in a haze in which he lived, for gold conjures up a mist about a man more destructive of all his old senses and lulling to his feelings than the fumes of charcoal. Anyway, it brought along with it a companion thought that if they were intimate, he would want to borrow money from him. So Mr. Ralph Nickleby shrugged his shoulders and said that things were better as they were. As for Nicholas, he lived a single man with the patrimonial estate until he grew tired of living alone. And then he took a wife. She was the daughter of a neighbouring gentleman with a dower of £1,000. This good lady bore him 2 children, a son and a daughter. When the son was about 19 and the daughter 14, near as we can guess, impartial records of young ladies' ages being, before the passing of the new Act, nowhere preserved in the registers of this county, Mr. Nickleby looked about him for means of repairing his capital, because he had to forego the £1,000 in order to marry his wife. He was now sadly reduced by this increasing his family and the expenses of their education.
"Why don't you speculate with it?"
said Mrs. Nickleby.
"Speculate, my dear?"
said Mr. Nickleby, as though in doubt.
"Why not?"
asked Mrs. Nickleby.
"Because, my dear, if we speculate with it, we might lose it,"
rejoined Mr. Nickleby, who was as slow and time-taking a speaker if anyone was.
"And if we should lose it, we shall no longer be able to live, my dear."
"Oh, fiddle!" said Mrs. Nickleby.
"I'm not altogether sure of that, my dear,"
said Mr. Nickleby.
"There's Nicholas," pursued the young lady, "quite a young man. It's time he was in the way of doing something for himself. And Kate, too, poor girl, without a penny in the world. Oh, what about your brother? Would he be where he is if he hadn't speculated?"
"Well, that's true," replied Mr. Nickleby. "Very good, my dear. I will speculate with the small amount of money I have left. And, of course, the value of the farm."
Speculation is a round game. The players see little or nothing of their cards at first starting. Gains may be great, and so may losses. The run of luck went against Mr. Nickleby. A mania prevailed in the money markets. A bubble burst. 4 stockbrokers took all the money and bought villa residences at Florence. 400 nobodies were ruined, and among them was Mr. Nicholas Nickleby.
"The very house I live in," sighed the poor gentleman, "may be taken from me tomorrow. Not an article of my old furniture will be sold to strangers."
The last reflection hurt him so much that he took at once to his bed, apparently resolved to keep that, at all events.
"Cheer up, sir,"
said the apothecary, that is the doctor.
"You mustn't be cast down. You mustn't be cast down, sir," said the nurse.
"Such things happen every day," said the lawyer. "And it is very sinful to rebel against these things when they are sent from above," whispered the clergyman.
"And it's what no family man ought to do," commented the neighbours.
Mr. Nickleby shook his head and, motioning them all out of the room, embraced his wife and children, and having pressed them by turns to his languidly beating heart, sunk exhausted onto his pillow. They were concerned to find that his reason went astray after this, for he babbled for a long time about the generosity and goodness of his brother and the merry old times when they were at school together. This fit of wandering past he solemnly commended them to the One who never deserted the widow and her fatherless children, and smiling gently upon them, turned upon his face and observed that he thought he would fall asleep. Chapter 2. This is where we meet the Mr. Ralph Nickleby I told you of, the moneylender, who is certainly not the hero of the story. We meet him at home. We meet his clerk, Newman Noggs, and we come to understand how he has, or who will be, involved in one of the worst scams, one of the worst crimes that you could possibly think, in which he and a number of other speculators plan to rob ordinary share-owning people of their money. But more of that later. Mr. Ralph Nickleby was not, strictly speaking, what you would call a merchant. Neither was he a banker, nor an attorney, nor a special pleader, nor a notary, a kind of lawyer. He was certainly not a tradesman, and still less could he lay any claim to the title of professional gentleman, for it would have been impossible to mention any recognized profession to which he belonged. Nevertheless, as he lived in a spacious house in Golden Square, which, in addition to a brass plate upon the street door, had another brass plate 2 sizes and a half smaller on the left-hand doorpost, surmounting a brass model of an infant's fist grasping a fragment of a skewer and displaying the word office, it was clear that Mr. Ralph Nickleby did or pretended to do business of some kind. And the fact of it required any further circumstantial evidence was abundantly demonstrated by the diurnal attendance, in other words, the fact that the man came and went twice each day between the hours of 9:30 and 5. A small, sallow-faced man in rusty brown, who sat upon an uncommonly hard stool in a species of butler's pantry at the end of the passage, and always had a pen behind his ear when he answered the bell. Although a few members of the graver professions live about Golden Square, it is not exactly in anybody's way to or from anywhere. It's one of those squares that have been. A quarter of the town has now gone down in the world and taken to letting lodgings. Many of its first and second floors are let, furnished to single gentlemen, and it takes boarders besides. It is a great resort of foreigners, the dark-complexioned men who wear large rings and have heavy watch guards and bushy whiskers, and who congregate under the opera colonnade and about the box office in the season, between 4 and 5 in the afternoon when they give away the orders. They all live in Golden Square or within a street of it. 2 or 3 violins and a wind instrument from the opera band reside within its precincts. Its boarding houses are musical, and the notes of pianos and harps float in the evening time around the head of the mournful statue, the guardian genius of the little wilderness of shrubs in the centre of the square. On a summer's night, windows are thrown open, and groups of swarthy, mustachioed men are seen by the passer-by lounging at the casements and smoking fearfully. Sounds of gruff voices practising vocal music invade the evening silence, and the fumes of choice tobacco scent fill the air. Their snuff and cigars and German pipes and flutes of violins and violoncellos divide the supremacy between them. It is the region of song and smoke. Street bands are on their mettle in Golden Square, and itinerant glee singers quiver involuntarily as they raise their voices within its boundaries. This would not seem a spot very well adapted to the transaction of business. But Mr. Ralph Nickleby had lived there, notwithstanding, for many years, and uttered no complaint on that score. He knew nobody round about, and nobody knew him, although he enjoyed the reputation of being immensely rich. The tradesmen held that he was a sort of lawyer, and the other neighbours' opinion was that he was a kind of general agent, both of which guesses were as correct and definite as guesses about other people's affairs usually are or need to be. Mr. Ralph Nickleby sat in his private office one morning, ready dressed to walk around. He wore a bottle green spencer, we would call it a vest, under an undershirt, over a blue coat, a white waistcoat, green mixture pantaloons, loose trousers. A plaited shirt frill struggled out as if insisting to show itself between his chin and the top button of his spencer, his vest. And the latter garment was not made low enough to conceal a long gold watch chain composed of a series of plain rings, which had its beginnings at the handle of a gold repeater. Now, a repeater is a pocket watch which tells the hours. In other words, it's like a very small clock. It doesn't chime, just makes a noise indicating which hour has been reached. That's why it's called a repeater. The repeater was in Mr. Nickleby's pocket, and its termination of the chain, that is, came in 2 little keys, one belonging to the watch itself and the other to some patent padlock. He wore a sprinkling of powder upon his head as if to make himself look benevolent, But if that were the purpose, there was something which would have been done very much better, and that was to powder his countenance, for there was something in its very wrinkles and in his cold, restless eye which seemed to tell of cunning, which would announce itself in spite of him. However this may be, there he was, and he was all alone. Neither the powder nor the wrinkles nor the eyes had the smallest effect, good or bad, upon anybody just then, and are consequently no business of ours just now. Mr. Nickleby closed an account book which lay upon his desk, and throwing himself back in his chair, gazed with an air of abstraction through the dirty window. Some London houses have a melancholy little plot of ground behind them, usually fenced in by 4 high whitewashed walls, and frowned upon by a stack of chimneys, in which there withers on, from year to year, a crippled tree that makes a show of putting forth a few leaves late in autumn when other trees shed theirs, and drooping in the effort lingers on, all crackled and smoke-dried, till the following season, where it repeats the same process, and perhaps, if the weather be particularly genial, even tempt some rheumatic sparrow to chirrup in its branches. People sometimes call these dark yards gardens. It is not supposed that they were ever planted, but rather that they are a species of unclaimed land, with the withered vegetation of the original brick field. No man thinks of walking in this desolate place, or of turning it to any account. A few hampers, 6 broken bottles, and such like rubbish may be thrown there when the tenant first moves in, but nothing more, and there they remain until he goes away again, the damp straw taking just as long to moulder as it thinks proper, and mingling with the scanty box trees and stunted hedges and broken down flower pots that are scattered mournfully about, a prey to rats and dirt. It was into a place of this kind that Mr. Ralph Nickleby gazed. He sat with his hands in his pockets looking out of the window. He had fixed his eyes upon a distorted fir tree planted by some former tenant in a tub that had once been green and left there years before to rot away piecemeal. There was nothing left very inviting in the object, but Mr. Nickleby was wrapped in a brown study and sat contemplating it with a far greater attention than in a more conscientious mood he would have designed to bestow upon this rarest exotic. At length his eyes wandered to a little dirty window on the left, through which the face of the clerk was dimly visible. That worthy chancing to look up, he beckoned him to attend. In obedience to this summons, the clerk got off the high stool, to which he had communicated a high polish by countless gettings off and on, and presented himself in Mr. Nickleby's room. He was a tall man of middle age, with 2 goggle eyes, whereof one was a fixture. He had a rubicund nose, a red nose, a cadaverous face full of wrinkles, and a suit of clothes, if the term be allowable when they suited him not at all, much worse for wear and very much too small, and placed upon such a short allowance of buttons that it was marvellous that he contrived to keep them on at all. "Was that 12:30, Noggs?" said Mr. Nickleby in a sharp, grating voice. "Not more than 25 minutes by the—" Noggs was going to add the public house clock, but recollecting himself, substituted "by the regular time." "By My watch has stopped, said Mr. Nickleby. I don't know what cause.
Not wound up, said Noggs.
Oh, yes, it is, said Mr. Nickleby.
Overwound, then, rejoined Noggs.
That can't very well be, observed Mr. Nickleby.
Must be, said Mr. Noggs.
Well, said Nickleby, putting the repeater back into his pocket, perhaps it is. Noggs gave a peculiar grunt, as was his custom at the end of all disputes with his master, to imply that he, Noggs, had triumphed. And as he rarely spoke to anybody unless someone spoke to him, fell into a grim silence and rubbed his hands slowly over each other, crackling the joints of his fingers and squeezing them into all possible distortions. The incessant performance of this routine on every occasion, and the communication of a fixed and rigid look to his unaffected eye, so as to make it uniform with the other and to render it impossible for anyone to determine where or at what he was looking, were two among the numerous peculiarities of Mr. Noggs, which struck an inexperienced observer at first sight. I'm going to the London Tavern this morning, said Mr. Nickleby.
Public meeting?
Inquired Noggs. Mr. Nickleby nodded. I expect a letter from the solicitor respecting that mortgage of Ruddles. If it comes at all, it will come here by 2 o'clock. I shall leave the city about that time and walk to Charing Cross, on the left-hand side of the way. If there are any letters, come and meet me and bring them with you. Noggs nodded, and as he nodded there came a ring at the office bell. The master looked up from his papers, and the clerk calmly remained in a stationary position.
The bell,
said Noggs, as an explanation.
Are you at home?
Yes.
To anybody?
Yes.
To the tax gatherer?
No. Let him call again. Noggs gave vent to his usual grunt, as much as to say,
I thought so.
And the ring being repeated, went to the door, whence he presently returned, ushering in by the name of Mr. Bonney, a pale gentleman in a violent hurry, who, with his hair standing up in great disorder all over his head and a very narrow white cravat tied loosely around his throat, looked as if he had been knocked up in the night and had not dressed himself since.
My dear Nickleby,
said the gentleman, taking off a white hat which was so full of papers that it would scarcely stick upon his head,
there isn't a moment to lose. I have a cab at the door. Sir Matthew Pupcart takes the chair, and 3 members of Parliament are positively coming. I have seen 2 of them safely out of bed. The third, who was at Crockford's all night, has just gone home to put a clean shirt on and take a bottle or 2 of soda water, and will certainly be up and address the meeting. He was a little excited by last night, but never mind that. He always speaks stronger for it.
It seems to promise pretty well,
said Mr. Ralph Nickleby, whose deliberate manner was strongly opposed to the vivacity of the other man of business.
Pretty well,
echoed Mr. Bonney.
It's the finest idea that was ever started. United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Capital 5 millions. In 500,000 shares at £10 each. Why, the very name will get the shares up to a premium in 10 days.
And when they are at a premium, said Mr. Nickleby, smiling.
When they are, well, you know what to do. You know what to do with them as well as any man alive, and how to back quietly out at the right time, said Mr. Bonney, slapping the capitalist familiarly on the shoulder. By the by, what a very remarkable man that clerk of yours is.
Yes, poor devil, said Ralph, drawing on his gloves. Though Newman Noggs kept his own horses and hounds once.
Aye,
said the other carelessly.
Yes, continued Ralph, and not many days ago. But he squandered his money, invested it somehow, borrowed at interest, and in short, made first a thorough fool of himself and then a beggar. He took to drinking and had a touch of paralysis, and then came here to borrow £1, as in his better days I had.
Done business with him? Said Mr. Bonney, with a meaning look.
Just so, replied Ralph. I couldn't lend it, you know.
Oh, of course not.
But as I wanted a clerk just then to open the door and so forth, I took him out of charity, and he has remained with me ever since. He's a little mad, I think, said Mr. Nickleby, calling up a charitable look, but he's useful enough, poor creature. Useful enough.
The kind-hearted gentleman omitted to add that Newman Noggs, being utterly destitute, served him far better than he could have hoped, and for rather less than the usual wages of a boy of 13, and likewise failed to mention in his hasty chronicle that his eccentric taciturnity rendered him as especially valuable in a place where much business was done of which it was desirable not mention made out of doors. The other gentleman, who was plainly impatient to be gone, however, they hurried out into the hackney cabriolet, that is, a hackney carriage. Immediately afterwards, perhaps Mr. Nickleby forgot to mention the circumstances of Newman Noggs, as he thought they were so unimportant. There was a great bustle in Bishopsgate Street within as they drew up, and it being a windy day, 6 men were tacking across the road under a great press of paper bearing gigantic announcements that a public meeting would be holden at 1 o'clock precisely, to take into consideration the propriety of petitioning Parliament in favour of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Capital 5 millions in 500,000 shares of £10 each, which sums were duly set forth in black figures of considerable size. Mr. Bonney elbowed his way briskly upstairs, receiving in his progress many low bows from the waiters who stood on the landing to show the way, and followed by Mr. Nickleby, dived into a suite of apartments behind the great public room, in a second of which was a business-looking table and several business-looking people. "Here!" cried a gentleman with a double chin as Mr. Bonney presented himself. "Chair, gentlemen, chair." Perhaps I could break off just very briefly to explain what was going to happen. Mr. Bonney and Mr. Nickleby and a group of other rogues had persuaded, and no doubt bribed, 3 members of Parliament, about whom we shall hear in a moment, to pass a bill in the House of Commons, which would set up this preposterous company, the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. They gave the impression that there were £5 million behind this company, and that members of the public could buy a share of those 5 millions, part of those 5 millions, for £10. And of course, once the company had grown and traded and increased in value, the share would increase in value. And a whole number of foolish men who simply wanted to make money would be not only out of pocket, but probably destitute, just like the first Mr. Nicholas Nickleby was when he speculated and lost all his money. Back to the meeting in the room behind the public hall. Mr. Bonney and Mr. Nickleby were received with universal approbation, and Mr. Bonney bustled up to the top table and took off his hat, ran his fingers through his hair, and knocked a hackney coachman's knock on the table with his little hammer, whereat several gentlemen cried, "Ha, ha!" and nodded slightly at each other, as much as to say, what a very spirited conduct that was. Just at this moment, a waiter, feverish with agitation, tore into the room and, throwing wide the door with a crash, shouted, "Sir Matthew Pupker!" The committee stood and clapped their hands for joy, and while they were clapping them in came Sir Matthew Pupker, attended by 2 live members of Parliament, 1 Irish and 1 Scotch. And in Dickens' time, Scotch would be the right designation. I know these days Scotch is whiskey, and a Scotsman should be described as Scottish, but in those days, Scotch will do. They were all smiling and bowing, looking so pleasant that it seemed a perfect marvel how any man could ever have the heart to vote against them. Sir Matthew Pupker especially fell into a paroxysm of bows that the wig on the top of his head threatened to be jerked off at every instant. When these symptoms had in some degree subsided, the gentlemen who were on speaking terms with Sir Matthew Pupker, or the other 2 members, crowded around them in 3 little groups, near one or the other of which the gentlemen who were not on speaking terms with Sir Matthew Pupker or the other 2 members stood lingering and smiling and rubbing their hands in the desperate hope of something turning up which might bring them into notice. All this time, Sir Matthew Pupker and the other 2 members were relating to their separate circles with the intentions of the government about taking up the bill, with a full account of what the government had said to them in a whisper the last time they dined with it, and how the government had observed to wink when it was said so, from which premises they were at no loss to draw the conclusion that if the government had one object more at the heart of any other than one object, that one object was the welfare and advantage of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Meanwhile, and pending the arrangements of the proceedings and a fair division of speechifying, the public, the victims, in other words, who were going to be persuaded to buy shares in this bogus company. The public were in a large room eyeing by terms the empty platform and the ladies in the music gallery. In these amusements, the greater portion of them having been occupied for a couple of hours before, and as the most agreeable diversions pall upon the taste in a too protracted enjoyment of them, the sterner spirits now began to hammer on the floor with their boot heels, and to express their dissatisfaction by various hoots and cries. These vocal excursions, emanating from the people who had been there longest, naturally proceeded from those who were nearest to the platform, and furthest from the policemen in attendance, who, having no great mind to fight their way through the crowd, but entertaining nevertheless a praiseworthy desire to do something to quell the disturbance, immediately began to drag forth by the coat-tails and collars all the quiet people near the door, at the same time dealing out various smart and tingling blows with their truncheons, after the manner of that ingenious actor Mr. Punch, whose brilliant example both in the fashion of his weapons and their use this branch of the executive occasionally follows. Several very exciting skirmishes were in progress when a loud shout attracted the attention even of the belligerents, and there poured onto the platform from a door at the side a long line of gentlemen with their hats off, all looking behind them and uttering vociferous cheers, the cause whereof was sufficiently explained when Sir Matthew Pupka and the other two real members of Parliament came to the front amidst deafening shouts, and testified to each other in dumb motions that they had never seen such a glorious sight as that in the whole course of their public career. At length and at last the assembly left off shouting, but Sir Matthew Pupka being voted into the chair, they underwent a relapse which lasted 5 minutes. This over, Sir Matthew Pupka went on to say what must be his feelings of that great occasion, and what must be the occasion in the eyes of the world, and what must be the intelligence of his fellow countrymen before him, and what must be the wealth and respectability of his honourable friends behind him, and lastly, what must be the importance to the wealth, the happiness, the comfort, the liberty, and the very existence of a free and great people of such an institution as the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Mr. Bonney then presented himself to move the first resolution, and having run his right hand through his hair and planted his left in easy manner in his ribs, he consigned his hat to the care of the gentleman with a double chin, who acted as a species of bottle holder to the orators generally, and said he would read the first resolution. That this meeting views with alarm and apprehension the existing state of the muffin trade in this metropolis and its neighbourhood, that it considers the muffin boys as at present constituted wholly undeserving of the confidence of the public, and that it deems the whole muffin system alike prejudicial to the health and morals of the people, and subversive to the best interests of a great mercantile community. The honourable gentleman made a speech which drew tears from the eyes of the ladies and awakened the liveliest emotions in every individual present. He told them how he had visited the houses of the poor in the various districts of London, and had found them destitute of the slightest vestige of a muffin, which there appeared too much reason to believe some of these indigent persons had not tasted from one year's end to the next. He had found that among muffin sellers there existed drunkenness, debauchery, and profligacy, which he attributed to the debasing nature of their employment as at present was exercised. He had found the same vices among the poorer class of the people who ought to be muffin consumers, and this he attributed to the despair incumbent upon them by their being placed beyond the reach of that nutritious article, a muffin, which drove them to seek false stimulant in intoxicating liquors. He would undertake to prove before a committee of the House of Commons that there existed a combination of nefarious persons to keep up the price of muffins and to give the bellman a monopoly. He would prove by this bellman at the bar of that house. He would also prove that these men corresponded with each other by secret words and signs such as Snooks, Walkers, Ferguson, is Murphy right, and many others. It was this melancholy state of things that the company proposed to correct, first by prohibiting under heavy penalties all private muffin trading of every description, secondly by themselves supplying the public generally and the poor at their own homes with muffins of first quality at reduced prices. It was this object that a bill had been introduced into Parliament by their patriotic chairman, Sir Matthew Pupker. It was this bill that they had met to support. It was supporters of this bill that they would confer undying brightness and splendour upon England under the name of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. He added with a capital of 5 millions to 500,000 pounds shares of £10 each. Mr. Nickleby seconded the resolution, and another gentleman, having moved that it should be amended by the insertion of the words "and crumpet" after the word muffin, whenever it occurred, it was carried triumphantly. Only one man in the crowd cried, "No!" upon which he was promptly taken into custody and straightway borne off. The second resolution, which recognised the expediency of abolishing immediately all muffin or crumpet sellers, all traders in muffins or crumpets, of whatsoever description, whether male, female, boys or men, ringing handbells or otherwise, was moved by a grievous gentleman in a semi-clerical appearance, who went at once into such deep pathetics that he knocked the first speaker clean out of course in no time. You might have heard a pin fall, a feather, as he described the cruelties inflicted on muffin boys by their masters, which he very wisely urged were in themselves of sufficient reason for the establishment of that inestimable company. It seemed that the unhappy youths were nightly turned out into the wet streets at the most inclement periods of the year, to wander about in darkness and rain, or it might be in hail or snow, for hours together, without shelter, food, or warmth. And let the public never forget upon the latter point, that while the muffins were provided with warm clothing and blankets, the poor boys, were wholly unprovided for and left to their own miserable resources. Shame! The honourable gentleman related one case of a muffin boy who, having been exposed to this inhuman and barbarous system for no less than 5 years, at length fell victim to a cold in the head. Beneath which he gradually sunk until he fell into a perspiration and recovered. This he could not vouch for on his own authority, but he had heard, and he had no reason to doubt the fact, he had heard of a still more heart-rending and appalling circumstance. He had heard of the case of an orphan muffin boy who, having been run over by a hackney carriage, had been removed to the hospital, had undergone the amputation of his leg below the knee, and was now actually pursuing his occupation on crutches. Fountain of justice, were these things to last? This was the department of the subject that took the meeting, and this was the style of speaking to enjoy their sympathies. The men shouted, the ladies wept into their pocket handkerchiefs until they were moist, and waved them until they were dry. The excitement was tremendous, and Mr. Nickleby whispered to his friends that the shares were thenceforth at a premium of 25%. The resolution was, of course, carried with loud acclamations, every man holding up both hands in favour of it, as he would in his enthusiasm have held up both legs also if he was conveniently accomplished. This done, the draft of the proposed petition was read at length. The petition said, as all petitions do say, that the petitioners were very humble, and that the petitioned was very honourable, and that the object was very virtuous. Therefore, said the petition, the bill ought to be passed into law at once, to the everlasting honour and glory of that most honourable and glorious House of Commons of England in Parliament assembled. Then the gentleman who had been at Crockford's all night, and who looked something more the worse about at the eyes in consequence, came forward to tell his fellow countrymen what a speech he meant to make in favour of that petition whenever it should be presented, and how desperately he meant to taunt the Parliament if they rejected the bill, and to inform them also that he regretted his honourable friends had not inserted a clause rendering the purchase of muffins and crumpets compulsory upon all classes of the community, which he, opposing all half measures and preferring to go to the extreme animal, pledged himself to propose and divide upon in committee. After announcing this determination, the honourable gentleman grew jocular, and as patent boots, lemon-coloured kid gloves, and a fur coat collar assist jokes materially, there was immense laughter and much cheering, and moreover such a brilliant display of ladies' pocket handkerchiefs as threw the grievous gentleman quite into the shade. And when the petition had been read and was about to be adopted, there came forward the Irish member. Of course, at this time in the 19th century, the whole of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom and sent members of Parliament to the House of Commons in Westminster. Now, only Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom and sends MPs to Westminster. So came forward the Irish member, who was a young gentleman of ardent temperament, with such a speech as only an Irish member can make, breathing the true soul of poetry. He poured forth with such fervour that it would make one warm to look at him, in the course whereof he told them how he would demand the extension of that great boon to his native country, how he would claim for her equal rights in the muffin laws as in all other laws, and how he yet hoped to see the day when crumpets should be toasted in her lowly cabins, and muffin bells should ring in her rich valleys. And after him came the Scotch member, with various pleasant allusions to the probable amount of profits, which increased the good humour that the poetry had awakened, and all the speeches put together did exactly what they were intended to do, and established in the hearers' minds that there was no speculation so promising, no speculation
more likely to make money, or at the same time be so praiseworthy as the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. So the petition in favour of the bill was agreed upon, the meeting adjourned with great acclamations, and Mr. Nickleby and the other 2 directors, scoundrels the lot of them, went to the office to lunch, as they did every day at 1:30. And to remunerate themselves for which trouble, as the company was yet in its infancy, they charged 3 guineas each man for such attendance.